Tim, our first beautiful day here in Los Angeles, and it comes with beautiful news at the same time. Toronto FC announcing the signing of homegrown player Sergio Camargo. Can you speak to what he adds to this depth roster that you've been building?
Yeah, so Sergio is an exciting player for Toronto FC for us to sign. He's a player who came up through our academy. Obviously went to college, took the university route. And in his most recent year at Syracuse University, same place where Alex Bono came from. And what we see in Sergio is someone who can change the game. He's an impact player. He's good with the ball, good with his feet. He can play as sort of an attacking mid in our 3-5-2 system or as a second forward. So you can never have too few of those types of players who can change the game with the pass, who can attack defenders 1v1 that can open up the game. He's an intelligent player, and so we're excited to have Sergio come back to Toronto where he's from and to add to this roster where that is evolving into one that we feel has enough depth to compete in multiple competitions, which is what we're going to need, especially in what we feel like is going to be a very congested May.
And this plays to that player pathway that you spoke of a couple years ago when USL was first, when you guys were first announcing Toronto FC2. This is part of that player pathway where a player can choose to go to university or college route, but then come back.
Yeah, no. Bill, Greg, and myself feel that the USL setup is one of the most important things we have at Toronto FC in terms of creating a pathway for our players to cut their teeth and to turn pro. And obviously with the more homegrown players, the pathway is going to be for them to get a year, for the most part, a year or two under their belts at the USL level. So whether or not that's the draft picks or the players coming up through the academy, this setup is perfect for providing the depth that Greg needs for roster selection on any given Saturday, especially when we have 3 games in a week.
You brought up the draft, and that's why we're here in LA. And in a couple days, we'll see new faces join the club. So when looking at this crop of 2017 prospects, is there an identity that you see common among a lot of them or out of this draft class?
You know, the last few years, I feel like the talent ebbs and flows with each draft. I thought last year's draft was one of the deepest and best drafts in the last 5 or 6 years. I don't think this draft class is quite to that level, but there's always gems, there's always contributors, there's always ways to find talent. Some of that has to do with each team's current roster and how they're capable of giving that player an opportunity. Through our USL setup, as well as our, some of the times in the roster or in the schedule when there's some congestion, I do feel like the players will get an opportunity to play at TFC. So this year's draft class, obviously we have the Canadian GAs. That's a new thing that we'll talk about. You have some very fast wing players, clever wing players. I think that there's some good players up top. Abu Danladi comes to mind as someone who I think will have an impact in MLS this year. Teams have also found that the players that you can find through the draft are typically center backs and right backs along the flanks. It's been more challenging for players in the midfield because typically you're competing with TAM or designated players in the midfield. So that's what we've seen over the last few years, and I think that trend will continue this year.
We've been treated in Toronto to the same returning group of core players year after year, and it really contributed to your success last season. So when you prepare for the draft, how far into the future are you looking when you look at the impact these players can make to your club?
Yeah, we want the culture in our club is that you got to earn your spot, and whether or not it's a draft, you're drafted in the first round or the 4th round, if you earn it, Greg will put you into the first team. Now that said, our expectations are that our roster is pretty much set, and you're going to have to fight like hell to get into the starting 11. We're looking at our USL players from last year first because they're already with our team. We feel like those players are probably in a better position to advance into the first team, more so than per se the draft class coming in. So what we're probably looking is for the draft class, especially where we sit at number 21, to slide into the USL positions, and then we'll be looking hard at our USL roster to move them into the first team this year. That's not the rule per se, but that's our guideline right now.
You brought up pick number 21. You have actually 3 picks in a very short amount of time. So taking that into consideration, or do you guys go in with the strategy of the best player available, or do you have earmarked a couple positions that you want to bolster in your depth chart?
Yeah, I think for the most part it's best player available. And what I mean by that is we're not going to pick a player who we don't feel like will ever have a chance to play in MLS, just because, if you're going to go by need, it doesn't make sense to pick someone who, we have a need on the USL team, but who will never play in MLS. He has to have a good chance that he's going to play in Major League Soccer for us to select him on draft day. But then once you get to players that we do feel like will have an impact, then you start to factor in need and positional need as one of the factors among many when you're considering who to draft.
And finally, we're going to touch on the Canadian presence. This will be the start of the 11th year for Toronto FC, and we're definitely seeing some of those residual effects this year. MLS announcing the new Canadian generation Adidas group, and we see 5 Canadians invited down to the Combine. What's your take or your perspective on the Canadian presence this year?
Well, it's obviously fantastic. I think the biggest change has been the homegrown player rule that allows many of these Canadians to be domestic status, roster status in both Canadian teams and U.S.-based teams, which never happened before. So that is a monumental shift in the way Canadians are perceived in the league, and it really puts them on equal footing with Americans and other players from other countries, because now they can be domestics, which used to sort of be one of the negatives for drafting a Canadian, is that he would be an international on your roster. So I think that set the stage for these Canadian GAs, and I think they're performing well. So excited about, I think what Canada has done this year, and I think obviously the series between Montreal and Toronto was epic, and in many ways the talk of the Combine and the commissioner, because it really showed the entire league what we can become as a league with our rivalries and with the passion of our fans, and with broadcast numbers. So again, I think Canada's on the rise, and I think the Combine is yet another place where there's evidence of that.
Tim, this is the 4th time I've been able to do this with you, and I know how busy you get, so I'll let you get back to it. Thank you for your time, and good luck in the coming days.
Thanks, guys.